In the dead silence of history, there are lives buried so deep in shame and cruelty that even time itself tries to erase them. But some stories claw their way back, whispering through the centuries, drenched in blood, injustice, and the kind of darkness that makes your skin crawl. This is not a tale of kings or saints, nor of battles fought for glory. It is the story of a man condemned by his own profession, despised by those he served, and trapped in a world where hatred was law and cruelty was survival. A man whose very existence became the embodiment of society's darkest prejudices. He lived not in palaces but in the shadows, where screams were currency, and his hands were forever stained with the lives he was ordered to destroy. Yet behind the mask of duty, behind the iron grip of fear, lay the unspoken truth. He was as much a prisoner as the ones he executed. The world knew him only as an executioner, but his true story is far more gruesome. It is the story of racism sharpened into a weapon, of injustice masquerading as justice, and of a life that shows us just how far humanity can sink when hatred rules. Stay with me, because what you are about to uncover is not just history, it is a mirror. And sometimes, when you look into that mirror, what stares back is far more horrifying than you ever imagined. The medieval world was a place where shadows carried weight, and silence often screamed louder than words. Beneath the towering spires of cathedrals and the endless clang of iron-forged swords, another world existed, hidden from the chronicles of kings and nobles. It was a world defined by the blood-stained hands of men who bore society's darkest burdens. Men who were both feared and reviled, yet utterly indispensable. Among them was one figure whose life was carved not by choice but by the merciless chisel of prejudice. He was born into a family marked by stigma, shackled to a profession that society detested yet demanded. His very name was whispered only when necessary, and even then in disgust. He was not seen as a man, not even as a servant of law. He was a curse in human form, the executioner. But unlike the myths of faceless brutes who swung the axe for pleasure, his story was a tale of inherited chains. For in this era, professions were not chosen. They were inherited like sins passed down through blood. And his family's curse was older than his memory, older than the village that spat at their presence, older even than the laws they enforced. Children were taught to avert their eyes when he walked by. Mothers pulled their daughters close, muttering that even his shadow carried damnation. The irony was cruel. The same people who despised him relied on his hand to carry out their justice. Justice drenched not in fairness but in spectacle, public hangings, burnings, and executions that fed the hunger of crowds who cheered at suffering, only to later recoil from the man who made it possible. The world he lived in was not merely medieval in its brutality, it was diseased with the poison of racial hatred. For he was not only despised for his profession, but for the blood that flowed in his veins. His ancestors came from a land that the kingdom called foreign, tainted, unworthy. Their skin was darker, their features sharper, and in the eyes of the villagers this difference was enough to mark them as less than human. In taverns his people were compared to beasts. In marketplaces they were mocked with slurs, denied fair trade, and forced into corners of society where survival came only at a steep cost. For most, escape was impossible. The stain of bloodline clung tighter than chains. And for him fate was doubly cruel. Executioner by heritage, outcast by race. His home was on the outskirts of the town, a shack where even the wind seemed reluctant to linger. It was here that he lived with his family, bound together not by love of community, but by their shared exclusion from it. Neighbors would not break bread with them, priests would not bless them, and children would not play near them. His surname was a brand burned into the memory of every villager, a warning, a curse, a reminder of the line that divided the pure from the tainted. As a boy, he did not dream of becoming a knight, a scholar, or even a humble farmer. He dreamed only of being invisible. But invisibility was a gift never granted to those forced to carry the title of executioner. When he was old enough to lift a blade, he was trained not by choice but by necessity. His father's hands, scarred from years of wielding the sword and rope, guided his grip. The lessons were not of honor but of precision. How to sever without hesitation, how to endure the screams without trembling, how to turn the horror of death into a mechanical act. Yet no matter how skilled he became, he was never seen as a craftsman of justice. He was seen only as the butcher of men, the tainted soul who delighted in misery, The crowd's cheers at a hanging never included his name. Their laughter during a burning never acknowledged his existence. Instead, when the ashes cooled and silence returned, he walked away alone with eyes burning into his back, as though he had committed the crime rather than carried out the sentence. And still he endured, because to refuse was to die. In those days, no one could walk away from their inherited curse. Refusing to serve as executioner was seen as defying the will of both crown and church. His family would lose their home, their meager bread, their fragile protection. Worse still, another blade might turn on them, wielded by someone with no hesitation to cleanse the land of tainted blood. This was his existence, trapped between duty and hatred, survival and damnation. He was a tool that society both needed and despised, a man defined not by his humanity, but by his function and his race. The nights were the worst. When the torches dimmed and the silence of the town deepened, he would sit awake in his shack, staring at the blade propped against the wall. It glimmered faintly in the darkness, reflecting not only the light of the fire but the ghosts of those who had perished by its edge. He often wondered if the blade judged him too, or if it pitied him. For it, like him, was a tool, bound to its purpose, unable to choose, unable to be anything more. What he could not know, what no executioner ever foresaw, was that his life would not simply be one of shadows and silence. It would become a story etched into history, a story of cruelty and injustice so grotesque that centuries later, it would still force humanity to confront the mirror of its own hatred. The seasons passed, and with each year the boy grew into a man, but the weight of his existence only grew heavier. The village may have tolerated his father's presence out of necessity, but when he came of age, their contempt sharpened like a blade. Now the whispers grew bolder, the insults louder, and the cruelty more deliberate. He could no longer walk through the marketplace without feeling the sting of rejection. Vendors would raise their prices when he approached, or worse, refuse him altogether. Children, emboldened by their parents' disdain, hurled stones at his back and shouted names that cut deeper than the rocks themselves. Their taunts were not just about his cursed profession, they were about his skin, his blood, the very marrow of who he was. There was no escaping it. Even when he carried out his grim duties with precision, the crowd never saw justice. They saw a spectacle, and in the corners of their laughter, he caught their true thoughts. Of course the tainted one relishes in death. Of course his cursed race makes him suited for blood. It was a prejudice that twisted his every action, denying him even the faintest chance at dignity. On the rare days when no executions filled the square, he labored in silence on the outskirts of town. His family maintained a small patch of soil, just enough to grow rye and onions, though the land was rocky and thin. The villagers said it was fitting, that cursed blood deserved cursed soil. They spat in the dirt when they passed, muttering prayers as if even the earth recoiled from him. The church bells tolled each morning, summoning the faithful into a house of God where forgiveness was preached. But none was offered to him. He was denied communion, barred from kneeling beside true believers. The priest claimed it was because his work placed him too close to sin, but the truth was simpler and crueler. His blood made him unworthy of salvation in their eyes. Even in moments of solitude, he was never free. The dead clung to him like shadows, and the living reminded him of his place. In taverns, when drunken men cursed his kind, their eyes would seek him out deliberately, daring him to respond. He never did. He had learned long ago that a single word, a single defiance could mean his end. The paradox of his existence was grotesque. When law demanded death, he was summoned like a hound. When order was restored through his hand, he was spat on and cast aside. He was their servant in life, their scapegoat in spirit. Every drop of blood spilled by his axe further cemented his alienation. Alienation. And yet there was no way out. The role of executioner was hereditary, passed down like a curse. If he refused, the crown would punish his family. If he faltered, another executioner would be found and his family would be branded cowards, stripped of what little protection they had. The cycle was iron-bound, father to son, blade to hand, blood to soil. Sometimes at night, he would wander beyond the town's borders, following the crooked path into the woods. There among the whispering trees he felt a fleeting illusion of freedom. The forest did not judge his skin, did not recoil from his touch. But even the trees could not silence the memory of screams, nor the knowledge that at dawn he would return to his shack, and the cycle would begin again. The only respite he found was in observation. He studied the world around him with quiet intensity, the way the villagers' faces changed when they were forced to confront their own cruelty, the way power flowed not from fairness, but from fear. He began to understand that racism was not just a matter of hatred, but of control. To keep him tainted meant to keep others pure. To keep him cursed meant to bless others by comparison. His suffering was not accidental. It was the foundation upon which their identity stood. It was in this crucible of pain that his mind sharpened. He began to realize that his life was not merely one of shame, but of revelation. He had been forced into the shadows, but from the shadows he could see truths that the blinded villagers could not. He saw hypocrisy clothed in piety, justice disguised as cruelty, and a kingdom that built its unity upon the broken bones of those it deemed lesser. Yet knowing the truth did not free him. If anything, it deepened his despair. For what could one man do against the tide of hatred that stretched across centuries? His ancestors had suffered it, his father bore it, and now it lay heavy upon his shoulders. He could carry the truth, but he could not wield it. He could recognize the cruelty, but he could not escape it. One evening, as he returned from a hanging, he found a crude mark carved into the door of his shack. A circle, bisected by a jagged line, a symbol of exclusion, a warning that even his dwelling was considered unclean. The villagers had not been content with whispers and stones. Now they sought to remind him that his existence was tolerated only so long as it served their ends. His mother wept quietly that night, not for the cruelty itself, but for the knowledge that it would never end. She had seen it all before, the cycle of hatred, the endless inheritance of pain. His father sat silently, sharpening the blade by the firelight, as if to remind them all that survival meant submission to the role they despised. And he, young, burdened and hollow, felt the truth sink deeper into his bones. His life was not his own. It was the kingdom's. His blood was not his own. It was the villagers' target. His soul was not his own. It belonged to the ghosts that clung to his every step. What he did not yet realize was that this relentless cycle, this brutal combination of racism and duty, was forging him into something the villagers could never imagine. He was not merely an executioner. He was a witness. And in time, his story would become the blade that cut through the lies of history itself. The years bled together in the rhythm of duty. Each season carried its own executions. The gallows creaked in spring, the pyres blazed in summer, the axe fell in autumn, and the noose froze stiff in winter. To the villagers, these were spectacles, grim entertainment to affirm their sense of justice. But to him, they were wounds that never closed. Every victim left a scar not on his skin, but on his spirit. He remembered their faces, the desperate eyes, the trembling lips, the final gasps. Some were criminals hardened and cruel, but others were little more than scapegoats, condemned by prejudice, by false testimony, or by the weight of being different. He saw women accused of witchcraft for nothing more than knowing herbs. He saw foreigners dragged to the scaffold for crimes never proven, their skin and speech marking them guilty in the eyes of the crowd. And as he raised his blade or tightened the rope, he could not escape the echo of recognition. Their fate was his mirror. They were hated for who they were, as he was hated for what he was. He killed them not by his choice, but because society demanded it. And in their deaths, he saw the truth of his own existence. Survival meant obedience, obedience meant complicity, and complicity meant he was both victim and executioner. The villagers' hatred grew more inventive with time. When he walked past, they pinched their noses, pretending to gag as though his very presence carried the stench of death. Children smeared mud on his door, drawing crude figures of hanging men and beasts. Women whispered that his bloodline was cursed. The demons walked in his shadow. Even his tools betrayed him. The blade dulled faster than it should, as though weary of its own purpose. The rope frayed too quickly, as if rebelling against the necks it was forced to embrace. Every object in his life seemed bound to decay, as though the curse of hatred poisoned not only his body, but the very things he touched. And yet, amidst the cruelty, there were moments, small fleeting sparks that cut through the darkness. Once, while buying grain at twice the price others paid, an old woman placed an extra loaf of bread into his basket. She said nothing, but her eyes held a glimmer of pity, perhaps of guilt. Another time, after a hanging, a child approached him not with stones but with a wildflower, pressed shyly into his hand. These moments did not erase the tide of hatred, but they lingered like faint stars in a black sky, reminders that even in the cruelest world, fragments of humanity could survive. But such mercy was rare, and soon smothered by the weight of scorn. His life was not his own. It belonged to the cycle of duty and contempt. He was needed but never accepted. He was summoned but never invited. He was vital but never valued. As he aged, the truth settled deeper into him. Society had built its order upon exclusion. Racism was not merely hatred, it was architecture. It defined who belonged and who did not. It marked some as human and others as less than human. He was not merely a man carrying out executions, he was the embodiment of society's boundaries. His existence reminded the villagers of their own purity. He was the line drawn in blood, the necessary monster that allowed them to pretend at righteousness. There were nights when he considered ending it all, laying down the blade, refusing the summons, walking into the forest and never returning. But even that freedom was an illusion. His family would suffer the price of his defiance. The crown would hunt them, strip them of land and drag them to the same scaffold he once commanded. His curse was not his alone, it was theirs as well. So he endured. He lifted the blade when told, tightened the noose when ordered, and bore the hatred that followed him home. He buried his humanity beneath layers of silence, as though to speak, to weep or to rage would give his tormentors the satisfaction of knowing they had broken him. And still deep within a question festered. How long could one life endure such a burden? How long could a man be forced to live as both tool and target, as servant and scapegoat? The answer was not yet clear. But history, indifferent and merciless, had already chosen his fate. His story would not end in quiet obscurity. The centuries would not allow it. For the life of an executioner, bound by racism and hatred, was never meant to fade into silence. It was meant to be remembered, not as the story of a monster, but as a warning of what happens when a society builds itself upon cruelty, when prejudice becomes law, and when justice becomes nothing more than blood in the dirt. The years dragged onward in a rhythm as merciless as the blade he carried, and the executioner's existence became a tapestry of suffering stitched with hatred, silence, and the endless echo of injustice. For though the villagers depended upon his grim hand to enforce the law, they treated him as less than human, a pariah whose very breath was seen as defilement, and so he lived in a twilight space between necessity and rejection, a servant of order yet condemned as a demon, his life consumed by the cruel paradox that he could never belong to the society he sustained. The town itself was a fortress of prejudice, cobbled streets and wooden stalls that bustled with life for others, but became a gauntlet of insults and cold shoulders whenever he appeared. For the butchers would turn away their meat, the bakers would spit near his feet, and the priests would close their doors before his shadow even crossed the threshold, while mothers clutched their children as though his touch could transmit a curse. Fathers warned their sons that to speak with him was to invite damnation, and so every step he took through that world reminded him not of his humanity, but of his exclusion. For he was marked twice over, executioner by profession, foreigner by blood, his skin a shade too dark, his features a shade too sharp, his heritage a permanent scar in the eyes of those who pretended at purity. His shack on the outskirts was not just a dwelling, but a boundary, a physical marker of the invisible line that separated the clean from the unclean, and each night when he returned from the square where the axe had fallen or the noose had tightened, he crossed that line into silence, a silence thick with ghosts, for the faces of the condemned haunted him in dreams, their cries tearing through the dark as if to remind him that he too was condemned not to die by rope or fire but to live in perpetual exile, a slow death stretched across decades. And as the seasons shifted, the cruelty of men revealed itself in endless shapes, mockery in the marketplace, threats scrawled upon his door, stones hurled in the dead of night, and always the whispers of tainted blood, for racism was the spine of their hatred, bending every act of contempt into a justification, making his existence not just unwanted, but unworthy, a living example of how society weaponizes difference, turning heritage into a prison and skin into a brand. Even when summoned for justice, he felt the sting of prejudice, For the crowds who howled for blood at the scaffold never saw his hand as an instrument of law, but as proof of his wickedness, cheering not just for the death of the condemned, but for the affirmation that he was, in their eyes, nothing more than a beast suited to cruelty. And though he bore it in silence, the truth burned inside him, that their system needed him yet despised him, relied upon him yet rejected him, depended on his blade yet damned him for wielding it. And this cycle of contradiction was more brutal than any execution, for it taught him that his life was not his own, but a stage upon which society acted out its performance of purity and power. And in the quiet of the forest where he sometimes wandered, he glimpsed what freedom might have been, the trees indifferent to his color, the earth unbothered by his profession. But always the illusion broke when dawn came and the summons returned, and he was dragged once more into the role carved for him by history, by prejudice, by chains of inheritance that no hand could sever. His understanding of racism deepened with every lash of contempt, for he came to see that hatred was not merely a passion, but a structure, not merely cruelty but control, that the villagers needed him marked as tainted, so they themselves could feel pure, that his exclusion was the foundation of their belonging, that every insult, every stone, every denial of communion was not random but ritual, reaffirming the boundaries that held their fragile society together. And so his suffering was never accidental, it was essential, engineered, a necessary cruelty in their eyes, and this realization carved into him a bitterness so deep it no longer felt like sorrow, but like iron seared into flesh. Yet still he endured, because to resist was to invite annihilation. To walk away was to doom his family, and so he continued, execution after execution, year after year, until the weight of silence threatened to crush him. And though he never spoke his despair, the air around him thickened with it. His eyes darkened by it, his steps slowed by it, until even the villagers sensed that their executioner was not merely a man but a spectre, a figure made monstrous not by choice, but by the endless cruelty of their prejudice. And what they did not realize, what history would one day reveal, was that in forcing him to bear this endless torment, they created not a faceless butcher, but a mirror so dark and so unyielding that when future generations dared to look into it, they would see not the monster they imagined, but themselves, reflected in every act of hatred, every cruelty masked as justice, every prejudice that sharpened the blade and tightened the noose. For his story was not simply the story of one man, it was the story of humanity's capacity to destroy its own, the story of racism sharpened into law, the story of how societies build their purity, not by truth or virtue, but by casting others into shadows. And in this truth, his cursed existence was destined to outlive the villagers who scorned him, destined to echo beyond his time, destined to force those who would come centuries later to ask the question the villagers never dared. What kind of society needs an executioner? And what kind of hatred creates one? The executions grew more frequent as the kingdom tightened its grip on fear. Rumors of rebellion whispered through taverns, and suspicions spread like plague through the villages. With each passing month, more bodies were dragged to the scaffold. More nooses were tied, more pyres were lit, and each time, it was the executioner who bore the burden, his hands forced to enact the law's cruelty, his soul further corroded by the weight of lives extinguished. But something was changing. The hatred directed toward him no longer remained confined to whispers or insults. It began to bleed into violence, open and unrestrained. One evening, as he returned from the square, he found his shack vandalized, its wooden door splintered, its walls smeared with filth, and carved across the threshold were the words, "Beast of Blood." The villagers had decided that his existence was not merely shameful, it was dangerous. It was no longer enough to treat him as outcast. Now they sought to mark him as enemy. They whispered that his foreign blood gave him unnatural strength, that his darker skin was proof of sorcery, that his hands, so accustomed to death, must surely hunger for it beyond the scaffold. These were lies, born of ignorance and hatred, but lies repeated often enough became truths in the minds of the crowd. The prejudice that had once kept him at the edges of society was now driving him toward its center, not as man, but as monster. Children began to sing cruel rhymes about him, their laughter echoing through the streets as they danced in circles, pretending to hang one another. Farmers refused to sell him grain, claiming his coin carried curses. And when a plague swept through the town one winter, the whispers turned into accusations. It was him. His blood brought sickness. His presence offended God. The priest, who had long denied him communion, now spoke openly in sermons that the tainted ones carried sin into the land. And though he never named the executioner outright, every eye in the congregation turned in the same direction. This was the rising tide of hatred, and he felt it pulling him deeper into despair. But worse than the hatred of the villagers was the silence of the crown. The rulers who demanded his service offered no protection, no shelter from the storm. To them he was a tool, a blade that swung only when called. If he was despised by the people, so be it, so long as he continued to serve. His family suffered with him. His mother's health declined, her body weary from years of labor and grief. His younger sister, though innocent of any crime, was shunned wherever she went, her face spat upon, her body shoved aside. She would return home in tears, asking why they were hated, why their skin was seen as stain, why God refused to claim them. And he, though older and hardened, could not answer. For the questions she asked were the very questions that burned within him, unanswered by the world that condemned them. The executions themselves grew crueler, demanded not as justice but as spectacle. Where once the scaffold had sufficed, now the crowds hungered for fire, for torture, for displays of suffering that blurred the line between punishment and entertainment. And in these demands, the executioner saw the true face of society. They despised him not because he killed, but because he reminded them of the violence within themselves. He was the vessel into which they poured their guilt, their savagery, their hunger for cruelty. By hating him, they cleansed themselves. By cursing him, they pretended to be righteous. One execution in particular seared itself into his memory. A young foreigner, much like himself in appearance, was accused of theft. No proof was offered, no witness spoke, yet the verdict was swift. Guilty. The villagers demanded his death, and the crown, eager to appease the crowd, sentenced him to the gallows. As the rope tightened around the boy's neck, the executioner saw not a criminal but a mirror of himself. Same dark skin, same foreign features, same fear of a world that despised him simply for existing. And when he pulled the lever, sending the boy into silence, he felt something inside him fracture. He was not just the executioner of strangers anymore, he was the executioner of himself. From that day the ghosts grew louder. Each face of the condemned returned in dreams, their eyes accusing, their mouths moving in silent screams. He began to dread sleep more than waking, for the nights offered no peace. He tried to drown the voices in work, in sharpening the blade, in the mechanical rituals of his cursed trade. But no steel was sharp enough to cut through guilt, no rope strong enough to bind despair. The villagers' hatred escalated with each passing year, fueled by famine, plague, and fear. When crops failed, they blamed the tainted ones. When storms struck, they muttered that foreign blood had angered the heavens. And when a nobleman's child fell ill and died, the whispers grew into shouts. The executioner's family is cursed. Their presence poisons us all. Torches began to appear in the night, flames flickering outside his shack, voices shouting for him to leave, to vanish, to burn. Each time the flames receded, but the threat lingered, and he knew it was only a matter of time before the crowd's hatred turned from words to action. And still he endured, not because he wished to, but because survival left no other choice. His life was bound to the blade, his family's safety bound to his obedience. But within him the storm was rising. With each act of cruelty, each injustice disguised as justice, the pressure grew. And though he kept his silence, though he bowed his head, though he continued to serve, the truth was clear. Something was coming. Something that would shatter the fragile mask of endurance and expose the raw wound of hatred festering beneath. The executions became the drumbeat of his life, pounding without pause, each swing of the axe or tightening of the rope echoing not only in the square but in his soul. And though he told himself that this was merely duty, merely survival, the lie grew thinner with each death he dealt. For the truth was that he was being consumed, hollowed, transformed into the very beast the people believed him to be. It was no longer enough that they whispered curses behind his back, for now they carved his name into walls as a warning, spat when he walked by, hurled stones at the shack he called home. And when his mother collapsed in illness, they mocked rather than helped, claiming her suffering was the rightful punishment of her cursed bloodline, and when his sister begged for bread at the market, she was driven away as if diseased, her hands trembling as she returned home empty and ashamed, and though he burned with rage, he swallowed it. For rage was fuel for destruction, and destruction would not protect the fragile family that depended on him. Yet silence offered no shield either, for as the seasons turned, the cruelty of the people deepened, driven by famine, plague, and fear, and every misfortune was laid at the feet of those who looked different, those whose skin was darker, whose lineage was whispered foreign, and the executioner, bound by both his blood and his blade, became the perfect vessel for their hatred, a reminder of violence made flesh. And while the lords and priests fed this hatred with sermons and decrees, calling him tainted, unholy, unfit to share in the sacraments of God, they never hesitated to summon him when death was required, for in their hypocrisy, he was both necessary and despised, servant and outcast, tool and target, and it was in this crucible that his torment sharpened, for each time he raised the blade, he felt the weight of injustice, the knowledge that many condemned were like him, marked not by guilt but by appearance, punished not for crimes but for blood. And one day, when a boy scarcely more than a child, his skin dark like his own, his eyes wide with terror, was sentenced to hang for a theft never proven, the executioner stood frozen as he bound the rope, for in that trembling figure he saw himself reflected, his own childhood stolen, his own innocence condemned, and though he wished to resist, to cast away the rope, the eyes of the crowd bore down on him, demanding spectacle, demanding blood, and when the lever dropped and the boy's body snapped, the executioner felt something inside him break forever, a crack that spread with each breath he took, with each night that followed, haunted by the boy's lifeless face, joining the chorus of ghosts that already crowded his dreams, and he began to dread sleep as much as waking, for in sleep he saw every face he had ever killed staring back, accusing, condemning, screaming in silence, while in waking he faced the hatred of the living, the villagers who blamed him for blight and storm, who came at night with torches to curse his name, to warn that one day they would burn him alive, and though they left each time without striking, he knew in his marrow that their courage was growing, that soon their fear would find the strength to become violence, and still the crown offered no protection, for to them he was only the hand that swung the axe, not a man worth saving. And as his mother grew weaker, his sister more broken, and his own spirit more frayed, the line between man and monster blurred, and he began to wonder whether the villagers were right, whether the blood that stained his hands had soaked into his soul, whether he had become the beast they feared. And yet even in this abyss, he endured, shackled by duty, trapped by survival, but the pressure inside him built like a storm, each insult another gust, each injustice another drop of rain, until it seemed the sky itself could no longer contain the thunder, and though he remained outwardly silent, bowed beneath the hatred of his world, inside him the storm raged, whispering that the time would come when silence would shatter, when blood would no longer flow only from the condemned, when the executioner himself would become the reckoning that centuries of cruelty had summoned. And as the villagers sharpened their hatred, and the crown tightened its grip, the path to that reckoning grew clearer, inevitable, carved by suffering, injustice, and the endless, rising tide of hate. The years that followed pressed harder upon the executioner's shoulders, for though his body grew strong, his spirit bent lower beneath the burden of cruelty. And while the villagers sharpened their hatred into open hostility, it was the crown's demands that cut deepest, for where once his duty had been simple, quick deaths upon the scaffold, it now became spectacle, drawn-out punishments meant to feed the hunger of the crowd, floggings, burnings, dismemberments, each act designed not for justice but for theatre, and he, their unwilling performer, was forced to perfect the art of suffering, to carve pain into flesh while the mob screamed for more, their eyes bright with a joy that revealed their own monstrousness. And though he despised them, he despised himself more, for his hands obeyed when his soul screamed no, and each victim who shared his skin, his features, his lineage, deepened the wound until he felt no longer like a man, but like a blade wielded by a nation intent on cutting itself. And when famine struck again and children starved, the villagers came to his shack with torches and knives, demanding that he be driven out, blaming his cursed blood for their hunger. And though soldiers dispersed the mob, he saw in their eyes the truth. One day, they would not leave. One day the hatred would spill over, and the fire they carried would consume his family, and so he began to withdraw into silence, speaking less, feeling less, until only the ghosts remained to keep him company. Their voices no longer whispers, but a constant roar, and in their cries he began to hear not only accusation, but a call, a summons to become more than the tool of others' cruelty, to rise against the chains that bound him. Yet still he hesitated, bound by love for his dying mother and broken sister, for to resist would mean their death as surely as his own, and thus he endured, though the storm inside him grew near to breaking. And when a noble decreed that all foreigners be marked, branded with fire upon their skin, it was he who was ordered to carry it out, to press the iron into flesh that bore the same shade as his, and when he obeyed, the smell of burning skin filled the square and the crowd cheered. But inside him the last fragile thread snapped, for he knew now he was not merely the executioner of bodies, but the executioner of identity, of dignity, of himself. And though he hid the fracture behind silence, it bled into his every thought, his every breath, until the line between man and ghost blurred. And in that blurring the path to his inevitable breaking lay clear, for hatred had built a fire too large to contain, and soon it would consume not only the villagers, not only the crown, but the executioner himself, who had been forged by cruelty into the very weapon fate demanded he become. The day of reckoning arrived not with warning, but with the sudden violence of a storm. For the villagers, maddened by famine, driven by sermons that named his blood a curse upon the land, gathered in the square with torches and pikes, their voices a chorus of hatred, as they called for the death of the executioner and his kin. And though he had endured their whispers, their insults, their stones, on this day endurance was no longer possible, for they came not as individuals, but as a mob, a living tide intent on cleansing itself with fire. And when the soldiers of the crown made no move to stop them, he understood the final betrayal, that those he had served with blood would now let him bleed, for his purpose had been fulfilled, his usefulness spent. And so when they set fire to his shack and dragged his sister screaming into the square, demanding that she too be branded as foreign filth, something within him, long restrained, broke loose with a force greater than any blade he had swung before, and for the first time in his life he did not obey. He did not bow, he did not kneel, but rose with the very axe that had served as the kingdom's instrument of death, and turned it upon those who had forged him into a monster, his arms moving with the precision of years of practice, his fury guided not by justice, but by the weight of every injustice suffered. And as the mob howled in shock, he became what they had always claimed he was, not man but beast, not servant but executioner of them all. And the square that had so often demanded blood now drowned in it, the torches falling into pools of red, the screams of the living mingling with the wails of the dying, until the crowd that had come to destroy him was broken, scattered, shattered by the very hands they had cursed. And in that frenzy of vengeance, he felt not triumph but hollow release. For though he had destroyed those who tormented him, he had also destroyed the last fragments of himself, becoming at last the monster their hatred had sculpted. And when the fires died down and the bodies cooled, he stood alone in the silent square, his sister trembling in the shadows, his mother already gone, the crown preparing its retribution. And he knew that what had begun as survival had ended as damnation, for the executioner, forged in cruelty and fed by hatred, had fulfilled the prophecy of their prejudice. And the blood that stained his hands was now not only the blood of the condemned, but the blood of a village, a people, a world that had driven him to this final breaking point. When the dawn came, it revealed a square drenched in silence, the air heavy with the scent of smoke and blood, the once proud village reduced to ash and memory, and in the center of it all stood the executioner, his axe dripping with the remnants of a people who had hated him into becoming exactly what they feared, his body still, his eyes hollow, for though the mob had been destroyed, there was no victory, no redemption, only the knowledge that he had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. And as soldiers approached, their armor glinting in the pale light, he did not run, he did not fight, for he knew the crown would not spare him. He had outlived his purpose, and the man who had once served as their blade was now nothing more than a liability to be erased. Yet even as chains bit into his wrists and jeers rose from those who survived, the truth was clear. He had become the final proof of their prejudice, their excuse made flesh, the story they would tell to justify centuries of hatred. See, the foreigner was always a beast. See, the blood of the outsider brings only ruin, and so his life became not warning but weapon, a tale twisted to serve the very powers that had destroyed him. Yet beneath the lies the truth lingered, a truth etched into the earth by every drop of blood spilled, that no man is born a monster, that cruelty shapes him, that hatred forges him, that injustice carves him into the very nightmare his oppressors fear. And as the villagers rebuilt and the crown erased his name, the whispers of his story endured, passed from lips to lips, some with malice, some with sorrow, until it became both legend and caution. And though the world moved on, the question remained, lingering like smoke after fire, haunting the conscience of those who dared remember. Was the executioner's final act the vengeance of a beast, or the last desperate cry of a man broken by a world that refused to see his humanity?